Little Primer is back-to-back conversations with someone passionate about their work and passionate about someone else's work. Mostly art and mostly Atlanta. I'm your host, Sean Mills.
A neighbor had installed a new TV, and it had come on this backing board. I guess they twist ties or whatever was used to brace it, and so it was this nice piece of wood. So a raccoon, I was dug in there, grabbed that piece of wood, and ran it into my garage. And then I was like, what am I going to do with this? And then it kind of clicked that would be a fun kind of concept to paint all these pop culture raccoons, from Care Bears to Beanie Babies to everything else. And so I don't know, hopefully it works both as the image and then also the story kind of enhances it a little bit.
Yeah, I think I saw that one, and that's when I posted that comment, right? So you mentioned that. I think that must have been around that time when I mentioned something that I picked up and salvaged. I don't remember what it was.
Your neighbor had drill bits. Was that it?
Yeah, those weird drill bits there that where Mike was confused about what they were, right? This is at the space, a big box of them. That's right. You're like, what do you mean you picked them up like a raccoon? And I'd never thought of it that way, but I'm like, that's resonated with me the rest of the week. I was like, yeah, that's exactly what it's like. That's on bulk. I live in a middle class suburban neighborhood in, Kennesaw, exurb of Atlanta, and I'm always blown away by the amount of relatively cool stuff that my neighbors are throwing away. So, and we have a bulk trash pickup every week on Tuesdays. So people, a lot of times on the weekends, will throw out stuff, and it sits there for 2-3 days until Tuesday when they come pick it up. So I'll even take the long route through my neighborhood sometimes to scope out what people are throwing out. And, I got a chainsaw once. I actually got a 52-inch screen TV, flat screen LED TV, recently. Oh, it was before Christmas. Even at work, I was telling my friends about it. They're like, man, that's like a Black Friday deal. And I was laughing. I'm like, that's exactly what it was. Yeah, it had there's a woman throwing out. She actually happened to be at her garage. I was like, hey, are you throwing this away? So flat screen TVs have this kind of well-known flaw, or at least in the maker community, and kind of handy, people that are handy, that they'll have these capacitors that just blow out. Capacitors degrade over time, so they're relatively easy to fix if it's a blown capacitor, right? That's not always what's wrong with them, but that might be the case. So that was the first thing that went through my mind. I've never actually repaired one. I've just read a lot of tutorials about this. So it's like, oh, if it's one of these capacitors, it's out. Between me or someone at the space, we'll get that checked out. I brought it home and I started testing it out, and it has 3 HDMI inputs. 2 of those HDMI inputs are dead, but one of them still works. And me not being much of a TV guy in general, I'm totally fine with walking up to my TV, unplugging the HDMI for the cable box, and plugging the HDMI for the DVD player, right? If I even need to do that. So I didn't even take the thing apart. I'm just happy to use it with a single HDMI input. And, it's the biggest TV in my house now, and we got it off the curb.
That's amazing.
Like a raccoon. Totally like that. So there's a lot of how I operate. So I thought what I want to approach you about was I'd love to have a little raccoon cartoony icon for my artisan climbing. It could be one of the mascots, right? Could be fun.
Definitely.
If we can kind of dial it in right, where it's kind of two-tone and something that even could be stenciled type of motif. And then the other mascot I was thinking about, because I would certainly describe myself as a raccoon, I guess, if I had a totem animal. But the other one that I've traditionally kind of within my family talk about is a mockingbird would be the other one. Right? So it's a mockingbird and a raccoon together, that would be even cooler to have both. So that was what I wanted to talk to you about. We could talk some more about that offline, explore it, that some more. But I definitely like scrounging around and repurposing material, salvaging material.
Yeah, not to belabor that, but one of our first collaborations is we went to the Zero Landfill event in Atlanta.
All right. Yeah. Which is exactly along that theme as well.
So, yeah, it was just basically a big garage sale of sample materials, and I still haven't found out all the stuff I'm going to do with it, but a couple things have come in handy here and there.
I still have the bulk of what I salvaged as well piled up in the garage.
With that, I'm going to welcome everyone, including you, to episode 41. It's another review episode, and I'm your host, Sean. Yeah,
Part 2.
And here with Tanju. So, Tanju, this is a good one to start it off with. We have the episode Jurisprudence and Joanna Wang was the episode you were not here for, so it's a good thing to talk about.
I was about to say. Yeah, absolutely.
So, of those two, which the ones that you want to jump in on, the Jurisprudence or the Joanna Wang?
Ooh, I like both topics. It was kind of fun to listen to it. I was a little bit surprised when the episode came out before we had actually talked about it. I think the first one is Joanna Wang because, as I think I mentioned previously, I didn't really know or understand where your intro and outro music came from. Maybe honestly, I thought it was like some previous girlfriend or maybe a cousin or family member or somebody. That you had sort of recorded, but backstory is a little bit more interesting. I think, if anything, we should do a little better job of giving her the credit, right? Just kind of having a credits that the theme music by Joanna Wang or something like that is for closing out.
Well, I was going to say, like, that's a part of the story is that, like, if you want to recap it just real quickly together, that, like, so she had this, like, kind of circuitous, like, online presence, and so it's like, I don't even know if she'd want to be credited, like, that it's like it would get her in trouble or something, like, who knows, like, that's part of, like, the
adventure. Mm-hmm. I mean, that would be a fun story for us to tell back about how we felt we want to credit the artist, and then it turned out to get her in trouble.
But it's a cool thing too, because like part of her like aesthetic as an artist was like to say that the internet is magic, and that like liking how like you can make connections and like there's like zero distance, and so she was very cool about saying like you could use some of my music as to play under your intro and outro, and I was actually kind of like thinking like I'm not even going to send it back to her to like for her to hear until like I've gotten a few under the belt, so it's not just like so that it's a little bit more polished or whatever. But 40 episodes in, maybe still polishing.
Yeah, I don't know. 40 episodes in, I think that's one of those you gotta take some action, right? I think you've got enough.
Oh yeah, and then the other thing about that was that you mentioned offline that you really liked the music a lot more once you heard the story, which Absolutely. I guess is true of a lot of my work, like the raccoon thing. It's like, oh, it's all right, and then you hear like, oh, that's a fun twist, or like now I like it even more. Now I know like it has a origin or something.
People like stories in general, so it just rounds out things quite a bit. And in this day and age, we're all, I think, overwhelmed, saturated with media of so many different types. That's very easy to just flick right past it, right, and go on to the next one. And it's very much that short-term little dopamine rush that happens. And I think having the stories grounds it a little bit more, right? A little more depth.
Yeah. I mean, like, not to get too sidetracked by that, but I also wonder, too, sometimes if it can be a crutch, like, shouldn't it just be enjoyed on its own terms, and like it doesn't necessarily need a backstory to justify it? But
it's a balancing act, it's like going out for a cup of coffee or an ice cream, and some of the people you're around or what the ambience of the place you're going to makes a big difference, right? Of how much you might enjoy that as well. So,
well, okay. So the other side of that coin was the jurisprudence. So, my friend is in law school, and I've kind of always had like a passive curiosity about the law, and then in particular, like when I was taking a writing course about art, we had a guest speaker that was like a lawyer, and she was talking about like history of case law dealing with artists and what like copyright and all that kind of stuff. And so like you were mentioning that you also kind of had a passive interest in law as well.
Yeah, so I think I'm becoming more interested in law as I get older and I'm on a career trajectory. I'm getting more and more involved and exposed to corporate contracts and legal contracts, and we're also I work in IT space. A lot of machine learning going on, and natural language processing is an area that we're doing some work in, and trying to do natural language processing is challenging enough as it is, and when you try to apply that into the legal space and into contracts, it just takes it to a whole other level, which is something I'm actively working on at work. So that's interesting. I also, like, as a maker and I guess budding artist or on the artistic side, there's that question about whether you're copying art, whether it's copyrighted or what's considered parody, or if you make a custom T-shirt. Like I made a custom T-shirt from the movie Idiocracy to give to a friend for a birthday, and I made one for myself, and it looks like something you could buy, and you can actually see copies of that online. You can buy them, right? But they're obviously not legal, I think, from a copyright standpoint, or potentially infringing. And I've very often found myself telling this to myself and telling it to some of my friends or even family, very brazenly, like, oh, you know what? If it's going to be a real issue, like, let them send me a cease and desist letter, and then we'll see, what we'll do about it. Or that's the worst they can do, because even with my hangboards, actually, this came up recently, discussing with my wife. She's concerned about copying something, and I was like, okay, I've sold 2 hangboards, so like the amount of I've lost money on the whole operation so far, right? They're not going to care, and if they do care, the worst they can do is send me a cease and desist letter, and then I'll probably just stop, right? But I don't know. That's me being a little brazen about it. I don't know if that's really how it would go down or whatever, right? Or how much I might be exposing myself to some kind of legal
One of the
risk.
reasons why I wanted to talk to him and why I'm interested in it is that it can be kind of liberating to know the truth, which is that, like, what you kind of touched on, I think, is true. That when someone's going to sue you, it's like the number one thing is that it's like, are you interfering with their profits? And so, like,
Yeah.
once, like, some of that stuff, it's like it can be a relief that you're not actually being a pirate. It's like, especially like the T-shirt thing, you can make stuff for yourself, personal use, like, zero problem. The problem is, like, if you tried to sell them, like, mass produce them, then that's when you're going to go in. And then the other thing is that you mentioned cease and desists, and that's another thing people should be kind of like empowered by, is the fact that cease and desists don't mean anything, in a sense. like when you have a lawyer on retainer, like, one of the things they do is just send out cease and desists. It's like a phishing thing, like hoping you'll just roll over, and like like the court date is the one that you should be scared of, right? Like, and so like that's part of the process, is that it's like, oh, I got something on legal stationery, like I better like close up shop. But like I would say probably the vast majority of cease and desist letters are like neither side will hear from either side again.
Just go straight into the circular file bin, and yeah, absolutely. So I was curious about Alex. I don't remember the entire episode, but was he also originally kind of trained as an artist, and he's made a pivot over into law? Because he's a little bit old. I think he even mentioned he's like a little bit older, right? Going back to school. It was a bit of an adjustment. And how did he get pulled into that direction?
He like was originally going to be a writer, and like most writers, like had a few like kind of decided, like, well, time to get serious, whatever that means, and he put his writing to specifically into the field of law. And I mean, like, not to be cheesy, but like, there's writing to be done in legal briefs, and I was even thinking like lawyers are kind of like problem solvers. Like, you can water things down to say like, well, everyone's a maker, but like, there is like a thing of like, if you're gonna say try a case, you're gonna need to be at least enough of an expert to know what's going on in it. So like, there's always a need for like a lawyer who has like a maker's interest in heart, and that like the stereotype is that they're just like these enemies, like boo to the government, boo to lawyers, boo to cops or something. But like you want like a good lawyer who knows what they're doing, right?
Oh yeah, I would love to have a lawyer friend. That's something I don't know, or I mean I know some lawyers, but casual acquaintances or casual colleagues, I wouldn't feel comfortable, broaching some kind of personal subject or personal question with these folks in any meaningful way, right? Or I wouldn't feel comfortable that I'd be kind of wasting their time or whatever. But yeah, that huge asset, and I think that's what a lot of really successful people, however you define success, you definitely have lawyers that are allies, or they're able to hire lawyers, right? Where you're paying them to be your ally. Sure. So yes, that was quite interesting.
Did you happen to? You said you kind of don't remember it that well. Was there any of the cases he was discussing sound interesting to you, or that they kind of like all blended together?
That all blended together. I think what struck me more was that he said he had access to some legal databases with case laws that he thought was interesting, and if I recall correctly, I think he might have said, or maybe this is what I heard, was that he wished that was more readily accessible or more open source in some way.
Yeah, I was trying to like pimp him to say that, but like the main thing that he kind of brought to the table was saying how it's almost like the pharmaceutical industry, like there are these like major brands of how you look up court cases, like a database, and you pay a subscription, and then they actively solicit you, like with like essentially camel cash. Like if you look up 3 cases, you get like a jacket or something.
Okay.
Is there is there an equivalent to being an engineer? Like, are there like a file server that you are subscribed to?
Yeah, there's like they're not the trade journals, right? So depending on what discipline you're in, I was a mechanical engineer, so American Society of Mechanical Engineering, they've got their own website with their own journals, and a lot of it's behind a paywall. IEEE, which is the electronics and electrical engineering, so a lot of the cutting edge electronics work kind of gets behind IEEE paywalls. For sure. Even, 3D printing, like for a lot of us novices and makers, we all, for better or worse, use a service called Thingiverse as a repository of 3D models where you can go share files and download 3D models for printing. But there's also private ones there where you got to actually go and people are selling their models, right? Because there's a lot of engineering effort and skill into designing a model suitable for 3D printing or for cutting on CNC, however you might manufacture it. And those things are also available. Even for computer graphics, for 3D graphics in the movie and video game industry, there's repositories where you have to pay a subscription or you pay by the file.
Did you have a take on that? Like, do you think like that the engineering phase is good or bad, or there's room for improvement?
I think there's always room for improvement. No, I think it's part of an ecosystem. I think it's good to have both sort of proprietary private repos as well as public ones. And there's ideally what it should be is you get what you pay for. So if you're paying, it's because you're getting some level of quality that's difficult to get consistently when you're in free space, right? Is the way I see it. Now, obviously, as soon as you start paying for things, people will start glomming onto being driven by maximizing profit. And one of the ways that you can drive profit up, at least short term, is to reduce your quality, right? Because that's cost, right? That takes away from your profit. So that's always a balancing act, and it causes struggle. But no, I think as part of a vibrant ecosystem, you really there's room for both. And in this legal space, I would hope that some of these database services, they're actually able to provide some higher level of quality. And they need to be competitive, right? And part of that becomes marketing and giving away perks and driving people to use it. So I think
that could be its own whole topic. like so many things spring to mind. I actually had one last kind of thought on that is probably the dorkiest thing you could ever imagine. But like when we were talking about like these databases and like the scientific journals, it reminded me of when I was a kid and I was big into Isaac Asimov. Did you ever read any of his work?
No, but I've had it recommended to me a lot, and I'm aware of him in general, right, as a sci-fi writer. I haven't actually.
Sure. Well, for people who don't know, he was the guy who wrote I, Robot and a million other books, like literally thousands of books. Like he had this distinction that he had a book in every like section of the Dewey Decimal System. Like every type of like fiction, nonfiction, he wrote about it. And something that blew my mind was that what got him started, like the very first thing he ever got published, was he wrote basically like a fictional like scientific report like on an element like that was being discovered, but he wrote it up like coldly, like as if it was like just like a report found like in a government facility, like completely dry. No, it was just kind of like coldly stating like it does this, we tried this, and what have you. And it was like they published it in like a fiction magazine, but it was like it caused like a little bit of a sensation, and that was his way into writing.
That's a cool story. Yeah, I wasn't aware of her.
Because like he in his books was like talking about that process and how like there are people like Robert Heinlein who he wrote something, it was published, no problem, and then everybody else, it was like you have stacks and stacks and stacks of rejection letters.
Yeah.
And that's how he got started. So I thought that was kind of cool.
That's cool. Yeah.
So the next topic was episode 37, Boxes of Brett and Shooting for TV. Do you have any reactions to that one?
Yeah, that was fun. First time we brought our friend Brett on, and he's quite passionate. He's definitely someone I've gotten to see up close and personal really develop as a maker, and having him share his story about the boxes was fun, and it's something that's resonated quite a bit with me that I wasn't aware of about myself, of also being interested in boxes, and a couple of other our friends. I think we mentioned Mike, who sooner or later will be a guest on this show as well. I was curious about your take, Brett, Sean, is if the boxes topic actually resonated with you, or is just like, it's kind of fun and interesting, but not so much directly with you beyond the
I don't know exactly the level of emotion Brett has, but I think I definitely have like obsession with boxes to some degree, because like I still have like a metal box that was probably used for like as a Rolodex, that like I've had it since I was like 8, but it was like, this is like a metal box, it's so cool, like I've held on to it.
Yeah. I think that's the thing about like Brett was kind of the same thing on that level, right? It's just something I think was an unconscious thing that he became conscious about as he found himself in a position to start actually making boxes himself instead of just finding them or collecting them, right, from another source or another use case.
Yeah. And another geeky connection was Brett brought up how, I don't know if it was a revelation, but he brought up the observation that boxes like are a building block, like literally, like you can everything can kind of be a box, or like that's like a basic way to do something is make it out of a box. And it's kind of interesting that there's also the digital version of that, like how if you use like Google Draw or even AutoCAD or whatever, that like you'll have like these default polygonal boxes that it's like at the very least you could construct it out of like these prefabbed like box tools. So it's like even in the virtual world, like that's like the go-to is like make it out of boxes.
Cool.
Or is that a stretch, you think?
No, I think so. I mean, that's essentially, a Lego brick is a box shape as well, right? But I also like the part that you guys brought about the, I don't know the exact terminology, but the, how boxes are used even in theater and in movies to represent a vessel of a person, right? It's pretty quite a revelation. Yeah, revelatory, and it kind of led into Brett's work in the the film industry as well, which I thought was kind of cool. I'm always find that really fascinating that Brett has that inside look into the industry as a camera guy, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, specifically he had that insider information about how for Mr. Robot they were shooting like basically kind of like a new version of rear projection where they would like have these big screens.
Yeah,
so
that was awesome.
It was kind of like making all things old new again. Like, because I think we can all picture like old Hollywood things where it would be like, you know, it's the person's like walking on a ramp and then they're like projecting like street signs in the background. Like that was like a classic Hollywood thing, and like now they're doing that again but in HD.
Yeah, and I think it also really reflects something I see. This is something I'm constantly arguing with, my kids are arguing with me about, but I see it all everywhere, that the distance between art and technology is not that there isn't a distance, right? They're very closely related, right? The work that the amount of technology that's involved in that work that Brett was describing is super high tech and cutting edge, right? In a lot of ways, HD film at a very large scale. But for some reason in our society, we really separate like the art people and the technology people, and they're two different things, and they don't interact together. My kids right now are, I think, as they're starting to grow up, trying to think about what they're gonna focus their life on and go to school about. They're very much caught into that line of, you know, there's the STEM kids and the art kids, right? And you talk about how art is the first thing to go when the thing comes up. But when you look at where all the interesting work happens, right, where everyone wants to be working, not everyone wants to be in movies. I think everybody wants to be on that level. They're completely intermixed. And I even told Mike the other day, we even use the phrase to describe technology. The highest tech stuff is usually described as the state of the art, right? So that's something that I get frustrated on, can get on a soapbox about. But talking to Brett always, that kind of brings that point really close to home for me, and kind of that line of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Another kind of hopeful thing that came out of talking with Brett was how he was mentioning how, you know, the technology turns over so quick that his friends will ask him like, well, what's the best kind of camera? And his expertise is like super narrowly focused, that it's like there's like 3 industry standards. There's like, I couldn't even name them, but like the Red camera is like one of the ones that are kind of like used, and it's like if you are a kid and you learn the latest camera, like you are as up to date as anyone in the industry. Like that's kind of like an exciting thing that is like, no, just by being here, like you're the next in line here. So it's like kind of empowering that, you know, it's not like, well, I didn't know how to use the last 18 cameras, so I'm too far behind to learn.
Right. I got to have 20 years of experience to be able to contribute or find meaningful work, right?
Mm-hmm. And so that leads us to someone who took that challenge, Caroline Dunn, who was our one of our most popular recent episodes.
Yeah.
She was an engineer who like decided to learn how to code, and she made her own project, and she made her run outfits. And so you've been trying that out?
Yeah, that was a really fun episode, because I had some doubts going into that episode of what her story was going to be. She coded that Alexa skill. I have been trying out the app. I honestly wasn't quite sure why people would need an app for running clothes, but hearing her story and kind of, I guess, how much of a commitment marathon running is, I totally get it now. And I've been playing with the app a little bit, even though I don't run. I've gotten a lot of funny looks at home about when I'm logging my runs and getting a recommendation from it. But wanted to drive some usage and get some understanding of it. And I've actually picked up on a couple bugs that she's got in it too. And I was going, the first time I was like, that's definitely a bug. Like, I got one. Let me send her a note. And then after I encountered that bug a couple times, like, I'm sure she's quite well aware of this. And again, with the limitations of the time frame that she's working in as a contest by herself, bugs are going to happen, right? That's probably so. It looked like she made it into the top 10, right? And now it's the final count. It should be coming out relatively soon.
Yeah, and so like this was a pull detail that I thought was fun was that like so she mentioned that she became a marathon runner, and one of the things I thought was kind of a cool insight was that within training for a marathon, you run half marathons as a course of it. Like,
Right.
so she was making the point that like some people their finish line is the half marathon, and they get like a trophy or whatever. But like she's doing half marathons on a Tuesday, no one's watching, no one's celebrating. It's just what you do to have to get ready for the marathon, and that was like a cool metaphor, I think, how someone really breaks through to like the difference between a hobbyist and someone who like really takes their hobby seriously, because like I think there's probably an equivalent for everything, right? That it's like once like your dad makes a birdhouse and it's like he'll make one birdhouse his whole life, but then there's like another person that they get the itch, and then like that birdhouse is the first of 100, and then they start there's like this threshold that you're doing the iterations as just part of it. Like I think you're doing probably with your hangboards, that it's like there's probably hangboards that no one's even seen by the time you get to the ones you're delivering, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that was quite insightful, and that's where again, kind of a newfound respect for running. Running's not an activity that I like to do. Kind of sort of make jokes about how I'm definitely not a runner. So what would I know about that or care about that? But hearing that, again, a little bit of the humanity of it made it pretty interesting. I enjoyed that. And it looks like the finalists are going to be announced in a couple days, so we may need to revisit that as well. It's going to be 2 days later this week, right after we finish recording this, but we'll have to do another recap afterwards, particularly if she finds some success.
Oh, one minor like correction I was going to make, or distinction. So in that same episode, I was sharing the news that Lady Gaga had won an Oscar, but in the train of thought, like I never made the distinction that she won it for like best song versus best actress. So in re-listening to the episode, I could hear how like when it got glossed over, that you could assume that I was saying she won Best Actress. She was nominated for Best Actress, but she won for Best Song, which is still awesome. But it's like I wanted to clarify that.
Absolutely, that's good, because it was funny. I thought it was awesome that neither Caroline or I knew anything about it, and I think we ended up spending almost a half hour ended up talking about women in technology, which I thought was also awesome, having Caroline on and bringing in that perspective. And it's something I'd like to revisit. And I work in a technology space, and this is certainly a topic that's very pertinent and interesting to me, and would like to continue exploring that and hoping to do what I can to drive a little more equality in the workspace for women. And it impacts men as well.
Yeah, and it's tricky because I think that was one of the kind of things that I was hoping for originally when I would have guests on the show, was that it was kind of like, here, give them their soapbox. Like, here, what is your like really personal topic that you want to share? And for that kind of thing, it can kind of be like, well, I don't want to have to be a ambassador to women per se. Like, yeah, that's hard to put on somebody like that. It's like, well, tell us what it's like being a woman in engineering. It's like, well, she wants to be an engineer first. I would, that should be like a level of remove that you're allowed to have. Like, you don't have to be an advocate all the time. You can just be an advocate by being a good example too. So that's like, you don't want to put people too on the spot, but yeah, I think it was a really cool conversation to have.
It's an organic conversation. I've thought of and been interested in bringing in more women and promoting, making women feel more comfortable at the makerspace, but I feel a little bit awkward, or that maybe a little patronizing of me to try to force it, and was hoping it'll happen organically. And I don't know how to make it happen more organically. It's something I struggle with. So having that discussion, I thought, was really helpful, and something I'd like to continue those type of discussions in the future.
Maybe it's something you can kind of like speak into being, where it's like you say that, and this connection with Caroline, maybe, if she can follow through with that offer to produce like a workshop or something, that'll be a nice low stakes way that people can kind of come check it out and be a part of it that way.
That way, absolutely. Yeah, and she did send me a note while I was out on vacation last week. So it's sitting there waiting for me to reply, proposing a date for coming and visiting the space and talking about the Alexa skills. So I am overdue. I got balls in my court to follow up and take her seriously.
Cool. Well, another female creator that made a big impression on me was Soey Milk. That was the episode 39. And so did you get a chance to check out any of her work online?
Yes, that was one. Again, as I've mentioned before, I really enjoy doing the podcast as it exposes me to these new creative talents. I did check out Soey Milk. I've started following her on Instagram. It looks like she still has an active Instagram, which was cool. I was taken a little bit by surprise on some of her work. I don't know how to describe it, easily maybe a little risque, right? It's definitely artistic and creative, but they're all appear to be figures of women, and that was something I was not expecting, or caught a little bit by surprise. I didn't get a chance to look at the counterpart to Soey Milk, which I think you said was Kent Williams. So that's one that's still outstanding for me to look at him. And I think you said, as you see the growth in they're coming together, right, as collaborators. Although I see, looking at it right now as we're talking, that he also has a lot of female portraits and a lot of women in his paintings as well.
Yeah, and that's important part of the story for me, because she'll pose for him, and it's so she puts herself on the same level, that it's you mentioned that it could be risque, but it's I always have to remind myself that I think of myself as an average person, but my barometer is way off, because having gone to art school and having the associated experiences with that, my concept of what's normal can be kind of off. So that didn't even occur to me to think of her work as risque. But once you say that, I can understand your perspective, and I think it's hard to keep in mind that you have your own type of glasses on, and I'm sure you probably even said to me oh, could you grab me that Spangler, and I'm and you're a baby should know what this tool is, and I'm I don't know what tool you're looking for, because I don't have that vocabulary.
When you talked about having to fix your sister's flat, with the
right. But maybe, I don't know, is that worth exploring more? That do you have would you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 as how liberal are you? Do you think of yourself as your tastes?
Yeah, I think, let me put it this way. I'm totally fine with the artwork that I'm looking at, and I think it's pretty cool. I wouldn't feel comfortable looking at it with my wife or my daughter, especially my daughter, right? If she walked in the room right now and I had this up, it would be an awkward discussion.
Right. Would you be in trouble, or just
No, I think it would just be awkward, and I think she's also right now in high school in a very sensitive place where I don't know if she might believe anything I told her, right? I don't know. Could be weird. There's definitely a couple where they're the women are topless, right? And it's in artistic poses, it doesn't look particularly bad, but I don't know. I don't know. That would just be an interesting kind of father-daughter experience of being okay, here we go.
Well, I think part of it too is that famously, people have said, what pornography is I don't know how to describe it, but I know it when I see it, right? And if you look at her work, the quality of craftsmanship, it explains something. It's not just titillation. There's obviously some sort of skill demonstration.
Exactly. I wouldn't describe it as pornographic at all, like not in any way, but there is like some exposure, right, or listeness that's
And for some people, that's all it takes. Like, if there's any
exactly
exposure, then it's inappropriate. Or, and then just we always talk about Instagram, and like that's something that it's like, if something is sufficiently realistic, sometimes women have to like cover up, right? Like that there's censorship to some degree.
yeah.
But like if it's considered like artistic, it doesn't have to be. So like you can look at Soey Milk's Instagram pictures, and there's no like emojis over the nipples if there is nipples in the picture, right? It's like considered, at least by whatever algorithm Instagram is governed by, to like say like this is allowed, like for whatever that's worth, right?
Right.
Was there anything like update on the climbing stuff we had talked about during that episode? Like we had talked about like the
I think we talked about is it the documentary, or did we talk about the Olympic Committee recommending climbing?
And we also talked briefly about the climbing for people of color. Like there was a project that you visited.
Yeah, and no, there's been no follow up. They definitely. I made a hangboard for an event that's promoting rock climbing in the outdoors to people of color. It's for a scholarship fund for an event in the fall. So there's no real follow-up on that now, other than I've got a bunch of ideas for how to contribute to that event coming up in October. And so I'm looking forward to participating in that and contributing to that event and kind of in that way moving forward. So no major update beyond that. It was well received, and I got a lot of good feedback. I'm getting good feedback from the climbing community about the hangboards in general. I guess the one update, so one, I get this really positive feedback. Two, I'm not actually selling any, I'm just getting positive feedback, right, in any meaningful counts anyways. And then three, though, I'm finding is that the handful of people that have gotten hangboards, even one guy that actually did buy one for me and actually paid money, they haven't actually installed them and hung them up in their house. They're sitting there, on the to-do list of, because they got to be installed on the wall. And it got to be installed securely enough that it can hold, an adult weight on it. So that to me kind of makes me chuckle that that's been the experience with these people. Because I'm like, I'm really curious to hear some feedback of like, is it working the way? Can you actually hang on it? Are you able to like exercise on it? And they're like sheepishly like, I'm afraid to say I haven't actually installed it yet, I'm going to get to it though. And that's, then I'm also feeling a little defensive, like I put them on the spot and I'm trying to be like, oh no, I didn't mean to pressure you in any way. I was just curious if and when you get around to it, let me know what you think from a functional standpoint. But, and it got me thinking like, do I need to do something to make these things easier to install? But, Mike and I talked about that a little bit, and I'm like, that's one that's thoughts definitely crossed my mind. That's a much more mundane, sort of just typical engineering type of problem, not a creative, artistic problem. I mean, it's definitely a creative problem, but less artistic, right? The fun part is in making this like visually attractive piece of wood, not how to bolt it to a wall of the 10 different varieties of walls that people might be exposed to, right? Drywall and studs and metal studs and wood studs and brick and whatever. And I think Mike had a really good insight was that, how someone's going to mount it on the wall isn't really part of the decision-making process of whether someone is going to buy it or not. I don't think, right? They're kind of caught up in the visually appealing aspect of the uniqueness of the thing.
Right. Well, and then it's in that zone of like furniture where if you buy it in the showroom, and then it's up to them to decide whether it fits their decor or lifestyle.
Right. Exactly. Right. So it's like, I don't need to get too caught up in that just yet. We'll see.
Well, speaking of caught up, we're now up to date, but I want to put you on the spot. Like, I mentioned via text that for this upcoming show, the May show, they were expressed interest in if you wanted to hang a hangboard there, like, but you're not like too confident in that yet, or you want to think about it some more?
I think it's more interested. So one, that's I figured you were interacting with the Maker Show when you started texting me, because I actually had a pretty stressful day at work today. So,
sorry.
and I haven't turned in my application for the Maker Show. I'm going to do that next after we finish recording. So right now, what's on my mind is like the project that I'm actually interested in submitting for that, and the hangboard is not part of that. I don't believe, I could be wrong. I would love to be wrong, but I don't believe there's going to be a lot of rock climbers that attend that show. So it's more of going to just be a novelty sort of thing. And again, how will I get it installed at the art station Big Shanty, and the potential risk of it causing some damage to their walls or somebody hurting themselves on it is something that I don't feel like thinking about too much right now. So that was kind of where we'll see. We still have a month to work it out. I may not submit it officially with the paperwork, right? But I may, if I come up with something, bring one and see what they say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can kind of pick up on your reticence, but as your cheerleader, I was just gonna say that, I think, there's lots of Kennesaw State kids around there, Georgia State kids, so you might be surprised by who might be interested in,
or even there'll be family members where they'll be like, oh, this is rock climbing. I know my kid or my nephew or Nate, whatever, is doing that, and it definitely helped to get the word out. The timing of the text message today just was like, oh, I can't think about that right now. Dallas.
But it's been a good run so far. I've been interested in hearing about how the Hanging Words have evolved over these last 10 episodes. That's been kind of like a serial adventure with us.
And excited about them.
Hope to have you for another 12 coming up here. And was there any kind of general thoughts you had, now that we've done a little complete review of all the episodes we've recorded together?
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed doing them. I enjoy going back and listening. I think we're meeting one of our goals is just to document things that are happening in kind of an artistic creative space. And I think that's happening. Definitely like to I don't feel like we should have a guest on every show, a special guest, but I do like the bringing in guests and some of that diversity that brings, and hope that we're able to continue to do that as well. I think the one thing we haven't done yet that we had talked about originally was the potential to even go out on location and potentially record content at events around the Atlanta area. So maybe there's some opportunities here, kind of in space as well, as we move forward with this.
I hope we can. So thanks to you, and thanks everybody for listening, and I'll talk to you again.
All righty. Take care. Thanks.
Find more information at doubleprimer.com.